All right, we're back along with Sam Nunberg. We've also got Maya Wiley back with us. Sam, I know you were concerned about Michael Cohen. What are your thoughts about his legal situation right now?
Well, I'm very sad, and I sympathize. Now, I may say I don't believe Michael when it comes to these issues. I don't necessarily. The fact.
Do you believe him?
Do I believe that he's saying
what he said yesterday in terms of his guilty plea about the president? That the president knew.
I believe that the president did not know at that time about Stormy Daniels, which is why Trump Org did not pay for it. I think if Michael wanted to, I think if the president wanted to take care of an issue like this, he would have taken care of it with Trump Org money. He had the money to do it.
Yeah, but you just suggested that Michael Cohen did these types of things for the president in the past. How do you reconcile those two things? That the president expected Michael Cohen to take care of these situations as his fixer? Because
Michael would take care. What I'm saying is that he didn't know. The president has said he didn't learn about this specific payment until after the election. I believe he didn't know about the payment until after the election, based on the fact that Michael took out the money himself to pay it. He could have gone to the CFO, who's already been subpoenaed. He could have talked to Alan Weisselberg. He could have gotten the money. So therefore, I don't believe what Michael specifically. I want to hear the specifics about what they're exactly saying, because all I have is what the reporting is, and I read the transcript. It's kind of vague to me if he's saying that he directly spoke to the president about Stormy Daniels.
When was the last time, really quickly, that you spoke to Michael Cohen?
It was interesting. So I used to run into Michael when he was staying at the hotel, because Steve Bannon stays in the same hotel. Okay. And Michael had texted me a couple weeks ago. I was looking for it yesterday. He had texted me a couple weeks ago because I said if we can communicate lawyer to lawyer. He asked for my attorney's contact information. I gave it, and my attorney had never heard from his attorney.
Okay. Mike, did you want to weigh in on what he was saying about the timeline of the president knowing and not knowing?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say, obviously, Sam, you know Michael Cohen, and I do not. Right. And obviously, you have more of a window into the operations of Donald Trump. So I don't dispute that. I think from a legal standpoint, there is so much evidence, both direct and circumstantial, that suggests, number one, the president at that point in the election, the issue of his sexual conduct was an issue in the election. And therefore, it seems when you have someone say, and you have a conversation where the president is directly talking about cash versus a non-cash transaction, even if it's in one of the other counts that Michael Cohen pled guilty to, it suggests a pattern of behavior that is consistent with what Michael Cohen pled guilty to. And I think my other question would be, why plead guilty if, in fact, to that, and implicate the president if he didn't have if he wasn't actually directed by the president? It doesn't help him one way or the other. He's already guilty of the count. He doesn't benefit by implicating the president when he's already pled guilty to his own campaign finance violation.
What do you make of the fact that Lanny Davis has been saying he has something to offer Bob Mueller, and even suggested it had to do with the hack and the attack on our democracy?
Look, when I was in the special counsel, when I gave, grand jury testimony, I was in there for around 5 to 6 hours. And there could have been, a lot of it had to do specifically with Michael. And the fact that they then, they put out Michael's case to the Southern District meant to me that they didn't really believe that Michael had anything of value for them. That's mine. Perhaps a professor has a different interpretation, or has a different idea. But I thought that in light of that, in light of the amount of time, and I mean, they spent more time with me on Michael than on Roger Stoney.
What were they probing you about Michael? What were they trying to get at about Michael?
Michael's role in the campaign, what Michael's type of role was going to be, and other issues. Business type issues, which just general things I had seen around Trump, which I just don't want to get into. There was nothing. It's nothing felony. It's nothing guilty or criminal, but at least I don't believe it is.
Okay. To that point, do you think you use the word Michael Cohen has flipped? Is that your assessment of what Michael Cohen is doing now that he has flipped on the president? Do you see it as that?
We all thought this once he hired Lanny Davis. We all thought, I had heard from obviously mutual friends and mutual reporters that he talked to that he was very upset with the president. Once again, I like Michael personally. I understand, I sympathize with it. But the minute he got Lanny Davis, or the minute he retained Lanny Davis for somebody like me, that was well, that's a little inappropriate to me, and I see where you're going with this. And when you have, and Lanny has said this today. Lanny basically wants him to be the John Dean to impeach this president. And I don't believe whatever Michael has is of that type of value.
Do you think that it was wrong for Michael Cohen to not trust the president and tape the president in some of the conversations that they were having?
You know, my idea, first of all, yes. Number two, I can tell you that I don't believe Michael did that tape because Michael wanted to protect himself or ever envisioned that he would be prosecuted by a special counsel. One, he envisioned that he would be in the White House. I think that if he did those tapes, as opposed to the phone calls, let's say you have an iPhone and you just take every phone call automatically.
Yeah.
Don't worry, I don't have one of those. But if you walk in and you're essentially wearing a wire to somebody where you've professed that you would take a bullet for him, you know, there was internal politics. He was always the one that was the closest to the president. He was the most loyal one, this or that, you know. Maybe he really wasn't. And that was very, very surprising to me.
Yeah, well, there's obviously a lot of speculation as to whether the president has also been loyal to any of his own associates and stuff. So I'm
not arguing that the president.
Right.
Listen, I've said the president did not treat me well.
Yeah.
Okay, with that, it's water under the bridge for me. It was a long time ago. But with that said, I understand. And that's when I say I sympathize with how Michael feels. I sympathize with the fact that Michael did not get a job in the White House. And oh, by the way, wouldn't it have been better had they just given Michael a job in the EOB? He didn't have to be in the West Wing. I think things would have been a little different had they done that. With that said, the fact that he was taping him, I think he was taping him so that, let's say, you can have a meeting with him one day, you can be off-site, and he could play to show you that he was important and he had this relationship with the president, and he would show you off the record. Little do you know he'd be taping you too with one of the other phones.
Let me get your reaction to the fact that Michael Cohen was the subject of his interview with the grand jury for a substantive amount of time. The agreement yesterday that Michael Cohen signed does not necessarily exclude him from cooperating with Robert Mueller. In fact, that still very much is very much still on the table, and is what a lot of legal analysts have expected to happen or are expecting to happen for what happened yesterday.
Lanny Davis, I think, basically
suggested it. Yeah, exactly. So how significant is Michael Cohen to the Mueller investigation?
I think if you have someone who has the length of history working for Donald Trump in multiple capacities, right, not just as an attorney, but also connected to some of his business transactions, including working on trying to get Trump Moscow, right, the Trump Hotel in Moscow. There's no question that that's going to relate to the Mueller investigation. That's also clear that he's going to have all the documents that he had, not just the tapes, but also documents, email exchanges, are all going to be significantly important into trying to understand what the communications relationships were between Donald Trump, close associates, business transactions, and even the possibility of whether there was any compromat on Donald Trump. So I don't think there's any question that Michael Cohen was always going to be a relevant, if not someone who actually committed crimes, someone who might be a fact witness or have documents or evidence. I think the fact that Michael Cohen was being asked, you were being asked questions about Michael Cohen. I mean, I think you previously have talked about how many questions you got about Roger Stone, and I think there's no question we might see some indictments on Roger Stone coming down the pike. But even if Michael Cohen hadn't committed any crimes, I think he would have been someone who was going to be significant to the Mueller investigation to understand what he knew and what he had. What we see here is Mueller kicked it out to the Southern District because it made sense. Michael Cohen was in New York. The crimes related to this happened in New York. It is part of the Justice Department, and they have the ability to actually leverage that evidence in the Mueller investigation.
So let me ask you, you know the mindset of the president. You're advising and working closely with Steve Bannon now, who also knows the mindset of the president. Right. There's reporting that there's great concern inside the White House after the developments yesterday involving Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen. What is your assessment of the president's mindset following these two developments?
Well, I don't know the president's current mindset, and I haven't spoken to him. But what I would say is this. I think that I think that this was something we expect people that are going to fight the impeachment. You know, it's funny because I saw you interview Congressman Jeffries. Yeah. He doesn't want to talk about impeachment. But trust me, they'll be impeaching him if they have the majority after 2018. And I think this was something that we expected in terms of Michael. I was surprised. I did not expect that Michael committed these other crimes. These were a shock to me that he did things like this. You know, people had said to me, "Oh, come on, you knew Michael was corrupt." I never knew Michael was corrupt. I thought Michael was, you know, a wealthy, successful businessman. In terms of Manafort, I would be quite surprised. I think the consensus is we would be surprised if he turned to a government witness. But it is what it is. Look, they went. The point is that the minute Rick Gates cooperated, they threatened him with 100 years. Meanwhile, they couldn't even mention him in their closing argument.
Really quickly, should the president pardon Paul Manafort? Do you think
he should not pardon anyone, and he should not fire Mueller or Sessions? Perhaps Rosenstein on the subpoena issue. He should not pardon anyone until after this investigation is over.
But you're not ruling it out as a suggestion to the president?
He should not pardon anyone until after the investigation is completely over, until some kind of report is submitted to Congress.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.